Welcome you all to the 5th day of the Teachers Online program on reading refugees, reading migration. The topic of today's discussion is detention and camps. Today's lecture will be delivered by Dr. Nasreen Chowdhory. Dr. Chowdhory teaches in the Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. She has a PhD in political science from McGill University, Canada. Her master's and MPhil degrees are from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She has published several research papers in national and international peer-reviewed journals and guest edited special issue on displacement, a state of exception in the International Journal of Migration and Border Studies in 2016. Some of her significant publications include Refugees and Citizenship and Belonging, a contested terrains, in 2018, and an edited volume on deterritorialized identities and transborder movement in South Asia with Nasiruddin in 2019, Citizenship, Nationalism, and Refugeehood of Rohingyas in South Asia, co-edited with Dr. Vishwajit Mohanty in 2020. She's presently working on two edited volumes on gender identity and migration in India with Professor Paula Banerjee. She is also an executive member of Calcutta Research Group, Kolkata. Thank you, and over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. That's a very generous introduction, not required, but it's always a pleasure and a privilege, I think, to be part of CRG, and also, to share my research with a group who are my colleagues. So a very good evening, and I hope you will bear with me because I'm just going to read out my paper on the camp aspect. But before that, I think let's just kind of say that, since we are colleagues, so there shouldn't be any formality. So please do, give your feedback, question, and any aspect that you feel comfortable. So I look forward to our interaction. All right. The topic that was actually assigned to me was camp and I think detention. But I kind of deviated a bit, but probably in the Q&A we can discuss it a little more further. Now, what I intend to do is discuss the idea of camp formation and situate it within the domain of forced migration studies. And more specifically, I actually want to draw on the exceptionality of the South Asian refugee camps. The conceptualization of refugee camps in the academia has largely been Eurocentric in the beginning, as a response to a specific condition created in the continent in the wake of 2 world wars. Even though the current literature emphasizes the refugee camps that exist in Global South, such as that in Africa, there is still a considerable dearth of work on the specific context and circumstances of the camps in South Asia. The colonial legacy, along with the post-colonial state building attempt in most of these countries, has not created a seamless affiliation between the people and the borders. The shadow of partition and the migration across the border of India and Pakistan in 47 and later in 71, during the creation of Bangladesh, proves the incoherent and rather ruptured affiliation between the people and the borders in South Asia. The state building projects in majority of the post-colonial countries of Global South has often precipitated to a carving of monolithic or homogeneous nations based on a vested sectarian interest, as seen in the case of Sri Lanka or Myanmar. Apart from creating the causal condition for generating masses of refugees and stateless people across the region, such attempts also complicate the attitude of the host communities in the already resource-starved countries of Global South towards providing protection to the vulnerable refugee who process over to their borders. The need to inhibit the movement of people crossing the borders was furthered and enacted by a corresponding political response of containing those populations within the confines of a camp, such that the refugee camps evolved into, within quotes, a de facto durable solution to the problem for uncheckered forced migration, to quote Chimney and others. camp can be seen as a temporary spatial construct conditioned by the uncertainty of exclusion and protection both at once. The prevalent methods of sheltering the forced migrants have led to a larger observation that the accommodation practices of refugees in Global South is hyphenated with refugee camp, whereas those of Global North are along the lines of asylum center. With accommodation of refugee being eventually institutionalized through various asylum laws in many of the countries of Europe, terminologies such as asylum reception and accommodation centers, asylum shelters and homes often take the center stage in Global North. The prevalence of refugee camp in Global South makes it imperative to understand the socio-political and cultural milieu of the countries that host a sizable population of refugees so as to assess the significance of camps in the context of the ad hoc refugee protection structure. This paper tries to build on an understanding of refugee camp in general and simultaneously attempt to bridge the gap within the literature on refugee camps in the context of forced migration in South Asia. For South Asia, the refugee camp is intertwined with the account of forced migration across the borders at the instance of mutation of colonial space to two distinct nation states based on religious identity. Arguably, the narrative of this migration were not homogeneous in nature. The inherent variation in gender, caste, and class has occasioned diverse experiences of partition for each person who migrated across the border to their new homeland. The relatively affluent migrant population settled in residential areas with proper housing and adequate facilities, whereas the socioeconomically deprived section settled in tents and camps erected in different parts of the city. That was also a spatially variant pattern of migration, such that there was continuous mobility across East Pakistan and West Bengal, at that point, of course, later, region of India. Whereas across the northwestern borders of India and West Pakistan was an instantaneous response to the partition as argued by Bagchi and Dasgupta. Both the countries established, that is India and Pakistan, established many camps in the nature of transit camp, relief camp, mainly in the territories of the states of Bengal and Punjab. The enormous number of partition refugees involved caused the government to reconsider the initial plan to directly rehabilitate them at the outset. Instead, they were segregated into three categories of refugee camp: transit camp, relief camp, colony camp, worksite camp, and permanent liability camp. The historiography of partition on either side of the borders have showcased the narrative of refugee life in camps at various places, such as those in Kingsway camp and the Kurukshetra sheltering those from Pakistan. Purana Killa camp that housed those on their way to Pakistan as argued by Zamindar. Similar accounts of refugee experiences in West Bengal has been emphasized by Joy Chatterjee, and those of Muslim refugees in Lahore was provided in the discussion of Talbot on account of the Walton camp. All these accounts of misery and plight of refugees in partition camps was obfuscated with the hyphenation of identity and politics, which was both implicit and explicit in the nation building of newly formed post-colonial states of India and Pakistan. Forced migration in South Asia, irrespective of the causative factors, has simultaneously witnessed ad hoc approaches of humanitarian response from the countries of the region to the population flow across and within the borders. Without completely abandoning the responsibility to offer protection, states have adopted a calibrated approach to contain these unsolicited and vulnerable sections in specific site of camps without interspersing them with the host population. The burgeoning of refugee camps as the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh and India, Tamils refugee camp in India, and various other internally displaced camps in Sri Lanka would also bear testimony to the significance of same. The refugee camp that showcased the enigma of both control and care at once started proliferating throughout the world, so much so that the 20th century became the century of camps, as said by Bowman in 2004 book. It could be postulated that the conceptualization of camp as a space that habituates bare life then could be used as a starting point for envisioning camp as a space that necessitates protection. While examining camp as a site of humanitarian protection of bare life, Agamben's notion of, and I quote, exceptional structure of camp that shelters bare life has been challenged in many scholarly works, such as by Martin, Ramadan, Sanyal, and others. A deeper discussion will engage with this in order to address the socio-political speciality of camps by elaborating on the protection of bare life, contestation of bare life, and exclusionary paradigm associated with camp itself. Camp should be rather seen as an ambivalent and contested space with multiple subjectivities that emerges through the everyday practice of refugees. This section reads as exceptionality of camps in South Asia. Refugee camps spatially materialize two concepts at its very core: segregation and exclusionary protection. The makeshift construct of tents and shelters in the camp are a reflection of an ambiguously transient nature for which the state has ideally conceived it, a space that permanently segregates and temporarily protects the excluded. The space of exception constituted by the camp defies the binaries of inclusion and exclusion to which a citizen and a non-citizen are both subjected to. Therefore, the exceptionality of camp is that the bare life of the refugee is included solely through exclusion. This section makes the argument that refugee camp in South Asia conjures a specific pattern of exception within the discourse of refugee camp that are overtly generalized as spaces of exception. This particular exceptionality is brought about by inhabitants of camp developing a sense of belonging to the host society that at once problematizes both the space of exception in the camp and bare life of refugee it shelters. The exceptionality is equally conditioned by two aspects: blurred cultural boundaries in South Asia and the absence of a definitive legal framework in the whole of subcontinent to guarantee the ambit of refugee protection. The two functionalities of segregation and protection of refugee camp need to be contextualized in an aforementioned specific exceptionality prevalent within South Asia. The notion of protection has always been inherent in the practice of hospitality prevalent in the subcontinent. The protection accorded in the earlier times and the current protection habituated by performative practice of hospitality both were not dependent on prerequisite of a law. Then delineating protection to those who are demarcated as others within the confines of the camp can be seen as a colonial legacy of the camp. This colonial legacy was being adopted and perpetuated by the post-colonial nation state in its attempt to institutionalize protection in accordance with its utopia of homogeneous nation. This brings in perspective the need to see exceptionality of the camp refugees developing a sense of belonging to the host state with reference to the functionality of segregation brought about by the camp. Refugee camp in South Asia characterizes fulfilling the requirement of unmixing of the refugees with the host population. These refugees are organically mixed and host society more than often through the shared sense of belonging they nurture emanating from common markers of identity such as language, religion, or culture. This makes it necessary to undertake a closer introspection at the space of a refugee camp so as to locate the exceptionality of South Asian refugee camp. The space of ref camp signifies many aspects such as socio-political speciality, the configuration of power assemblage. It embodies or even simplify its structural design. But the ambiguous spatial and temporal functionality of camp specifically indicates the instrumentality of camp as a finite space that caters to mass accommodation of refugees over an extended period of time. The confines of interpretational sovereignty make it a tedious task to define camp from the ambit of refugee accommodation. More than often, such definition that tags and characterize such spaces are determined by the political, administrative, and organizational disposition of entities that govern them. Even then, the conceptualization of refugee camp as spaces of refugee accommodation, as argued by Harold Bourne and others, can be seen from the lens of scholarly postulations such as Goffman's notion of total institution, Aig's theory of non-place, or Foucauldian notion of heterotopia. The space of a refugee camp being central to its speciality, we need to engage with a diverse set of literature. In his work of Other Spaces, Foucault postulates that the symbolic relevance of a certain space as being derived from the reflective implication of spaces that they inherently juxtapose. Foucault refers to these counterposing spaces as heterotopias and often reflect, contest, and invert the normalized spaces that we occupy. They construe illusory spaces that in turn expose the reality of a messy, ill-constructed, and jumbled material spaces that we inhabit. As sites of alternate ordering, where distinct approaches of control and freedom are envisaged, heterotopia mold the collective space that we occupy as essentially different from the space that encircles us. For the refugee, camp is internalized as spatially bounded manifestation of repressive life in exile. But this internalization of speciality of camp is done with reference to the place of origin of refugees. They navigate their everyday life in camps within the confines of order and control administered by the camp authorities, yet habituated by limited care and conditioned protection from the humanitarian aid organization. Caught between contentious spectrum of control, order, and protection, refugee juxtaposes his space of exile life in camp with his space of homeland. The observation of heterotopic space as being a zone that ascertains its difference through underscoring the unity that it encloses, to quote Foucault, becomes pertinent in the context of porous border and forced migration in South Asia. The refugee camp that shelter these forced migrants became the heterotopic space that mirrors the utopia of host society that surrounds it. The attempt to carve culturally homogeneous state created tangible fiction that in turn caused separatist movement, minority persecution, and explicit state orchestrated violence on a targeted minority population in countries of South Asia. This created conditions for forced migration of these vulnerable population, in turn creating influx of refugees to the neighboring countries. The notion of homogeneous state building caused the host state to segregate the refugee from its own population. By demarcating the camp to the outskirts, the state carves intangible boundaries of segregation and separation within its tangible boundaries. The contouring of undesirable refugee of a specific identity to a heterotopia of camp does resonate a utopia of a homogeneous society that the state desires to create. Heterotopia of camp thus permits us to create an illusory mirror that effects of otherness vis-a-vis us that resides in the utopia. As opined by Aguirre, even the otherness constructed is one without substance in the image of non-existent, inaccessible thought, end of quote, of utopia. Spaces of refugee camp in South Asia can be problematized from various theoretical perspectives. Building on Michael Kitto's differentiation of space and place, Aguirre conceptualizes space in lines of anthropological space. Despite of its abstraction as a merely geographical variable, space inherently comprises in itself both aspects of the place and a non-place. The actuality of place is conditioned by its historical, relational, and identical existence for an individual. When the people of communities who occupy a particular place strive to nurture and protect the history, relationship, identity associated with that space through ritual, tradition, and practice, they carve out a place out of that abstract space. The population within the boundaries of a place does develop a collective identity shaped by an unformulated rules of living know-how that would eventually inculcate a common sense of belonging within the inhabitants of the place. The concept of non-place does not have the variable of history, relation, or identity associated with it. Rather, it is characterized by the absence of these variables. These non-places are unstable, dynamic spaces that are in constant flux. It can only inculcate a strange sense of acquaintance for those within rather than developing the notion of belonging in them. Apart from being a definitive outcome arising from the various contingencies of supermodernity, refugee camp epitomizes a space of indistinction, central to a non-place, like an entity who enters the demarcated space of non-place is relieved of his usual determinant. AK argues that what really constituted is a characteristic of an inmate entering spatial boundary of camp is relegated to oblivion. The extraterritorial nature where they are in and not of, the context in which they are located exceptionally is what is common both to the conceptualization of non-place and refugee camps in general. By the same logic of this comparison, refugee camps function as non-symbolized abstract spaces that do not associate meaning, tradition, and sacrifice or ritual moments. In perpetuating the logic of exclusion, refugee camps can be compared to the conceptualization of non-place, so much so that the non-place territorializes the biopolitic operative of camp via the exclusive entrance and exit. But from the perspective of refugee, the camps in South Asia differ from this analogy of non-places. The brief historiography of camp provided would suggest that the logic of exclusion and segregation that epitomizes a refugee camp is in fact a colonial inheritance which is being co-opted in the post-colonial state. The camp refugees inculcate a sense of belonging in the space of the host state and to the host population during exile, owing to the shared culture and ethnicity. The ethnic kinship between the people in host state and the refugee is one among the many factors that shape their sense of belonging, as the refugees have an inherent inclination to seek asylum in a society that shares a similar language, culture, and kinship structure. The post-colonial nation state that hosts them might factor in the shared cultural affiliation as a potential threat that would encourage more influx of refugees or instill an aversion to the repatriation process, which over a prolonged period can precipitate political unrest due to changed demographic pattern of the population. This perception of host state only incentivizes the biased protection of refugee and asylum seekers by restricting them to camps. In doing so, it invokes unique exceptionality for the refugees inhabiting the perennially exceptional space of refugee camp. Drawing on Malki's observation based on the empirical case that I had looked at very earlier on the Chakmas and the Sri Lankan, I have elsewhere argued that the camp refugees perceive themselves as deterritorialized people with deep association with the physical location of campsite. And often what they attempt to do is re-territorialize their existence in exile and while living in camps. Then the universality of refugee camp being non-place can be very well contested in the refugee camps in South Asia. This notion of camp being a non-place characterized by absence history relation is contested, interestingly, by those, or specifically within the situation of South Asia, where a strong sense of belonging is actually what propels them, along with a sense of ethnicity, cultural, linguistic affinity with that of the host population. Skoch, in his study of Afghan refugee, opined that the camps in Afghanistan in the 80s were referred to as refugee villages so as to prevent the military implication associated with the camp. Whereas Ramesh and others have argued that the idea that sometimes camp have been used as, or has been, another word has been used, which is called welfare camp or welfare village, which essentially suggests that people are in transit. This rightly denotes that the emphasis or on the notion of refugee camp is politically inclined concept and hence should be considered as fluid, culturally, temporally, and spatially. At the same time, a government's notion of refugee camp as a site of exception where bare life is maneuvered neglect the presence of multiple agencies within the state of exception and often underplays the possibility and protection of refugees subject to contest their bare life in camp. They have not just been, or camps should not be just seen as humanitarian spaces that offer care and compassion to the refugees or spaces of control. They systematically institutionalized also as segregation that separates them from that of the host population with whom they share common culture or let's say kinship. This is further argued or can be argued that the assertion that refugee camps are not inexorable responses to the predicament of forced migration, one can therefore suggest that it can be seen as spaces of confinement that unjustly validates the calculated detention of refugees, thereby abrogating their rights in the so-called humanitarian space. Refugees neither have any functional prospect in the country of asylum, nor many chances to be incorporated in the larger society. And very typical case in point would be the Sri Lankan refugee situation. Essentially, they are discarded to the dumping site of camps from which there is no return or no road forward. It is this state of suspended animation that refugees in camp undergo, as suggested by Aguirre, who refers it as frozen transients, where temporary transforms to permanent. The evolving sociopolitical dynamics in which such ambiguous permanence of refugee camp validates Nadson's postulation that the hybrid space of camp, that are transitional zones of emplacement, has expanded, transmuted into campscape, urban slums, or hyperghettos by transcending the spatial and the temporal borders of the camp. The constitution of massive detention camps in Assam for housing those recently excluded from the NRC, and even the recent conflation of redundant, state of Bhashanchar in Bangladesh was where refugees were supposed to be housed where there's no tangible fence, seems to be an no escape route where it appears to be the only place where the other needs to be segregated and who has no claim on the utopia of homogeneous nation. So in conclusion, I want to say the following. While discussing the discourse on forced migration, it is impossible to overlook the centrality of refugee camp as spatial sites that shelters the undesirable. This is even more pertinent in the context of South Asia, as I have demonstrated, where shared post-colonial history of countries has conjured a distinct socio-cultural milieu in which the forced migration needs to be analyzed. Causative analysis of forced migration in South Asia, among other causes such as natural disaster, climate change, development induced, so on, significantly showcases the negative impact of post-colonial state building that attempts to carve homogeneous population by relegating different cultural, ethnic, religious minorities to the margin of the state, forcing them to migrate. Despite of not being the 1951 Refugee Convention or not having a concerted regional framework for refugee protection, countries like India and others let the vulnerable forced migrants to enter the territory. What happens to them later is a very interesting scenario, which we can discuss in the Q&A. This tacit consent for admission and basic protection offered to the refugees on entering the border is based on performative practice of hospitality grounded on a principle of humanitarianism. Historiography is the first section that helps to contextualize that colonial spaces of segregating and demarcating as something that has been carried forward in the post-colonial state formation, evolving from what has been termed as, let's say, concept of containment. Refugee camps in South Asia, especially the partition refugee camp, had become sites of short-term emergency aid and assistance centers which address the post-migration in the aftermath of partition. The nature of protection offered through refugee camp to various groups of people have varied in both approach and impact since then, owing to the vested political priorities of countries in South Asia. Reflecting on the observation made in the earlier section, it should be reiterated that camps in South Asia are not merely sites of humanitarian protection, spaces that assert control by methodically establishing patterns of segregation or zones of destitution that identify and occupy populace as victims lacking agency. The camps in South Asia exhibit a situation of exception within the spaces of exception that camps are generally tethered to. The fuzzy cultural boundaries that were not analogous to borders established by modern nation states of South Asia occasioned the emergence of a common sense of belonging among the people. In the absence of a legal framework for refugee protection, the exceptionality of camps in South Asia is constituted by the sense of belonging that the refugees develop towards their host and society. These camps, by virtue of the attributes of shared ethnicity, culture, language, religion of inmates with that of the host society, contest the prevalent analogies of camps as non-places. They are hence indicative of heterotopias that in turn reflect the utopia of homogeneous society that the nation state created or desired to create through the post-colonial state building in South Asia. The permanent exclusion of refugees in the camp served as an effective instrument for post-colonial nation state to enforce a segregated protection that prevents the refugees from being integrated for these refugees, thereby condemning them to a perpetually extended exile in camps. As opined by Eger, it is necessary to acknowledge camps to be occupying the centrality of margins, within quotes, in the context of forced migration generally, and more specifically, I would say in the context of South Asia. The exceptionality of the sense of belonging among the South Asian camps and camp refugees cannot be overlooked because simply of its density of blanket space of exception that camps are usually typecast to. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for your lecture. And now there are a couple of questions in the chat box. The first question is from Dr. Sudeep Basu.
Yeah. Hi, Nasreen. So as always, I enjoyed your presentation, and a lot of ideas have come, and going back to earlier discussions that we have had. Looking at the camp once more, part of it I have written down. One is the idea that one is trying to contest is the idea of refugee camps as transient. Now we are increasingly seeing a situation where the more durable stable structures of the camps are coming up because of the conflicting relations between nation states, which is not allowing these camps to wound up and disappear. They are remaining as permanent structures. So once these camps are thought of as semi-permanent and in various forms, many of these residents are beginning to develop a sort of, develop a more durable conceptions of their selves, and which are constantly oscillating between, either between various structures and various spaces that they are inhabiting. Some of them are confined to the camps, but some of them are, as we know, moving to the peripheries, moving outside and coming back from work, or, depending on the kind of refugee groups that we are talking about. But when we are talking about these forced migrants who are developing new identities, building on their pre-migrant identities, there is this constant defying of the classificatory ordering that is an undertaking of the state. Now, this defying of these classificatory orderings also helps us to understand how we are going to now think about the utopias that we are talking about. Now, these utopias and the heterotopic relations and imaginations are taking place because of these different kinds of experiences that these refugees are taking, and also the media, which is allowing these refugees to also develop all kinds of conceptions about themselves and the world, not in deference to, but in conflict with the classificatory ordering. Now, when we are talking about utopias, we are here, I think, entering into a little bit of a dangerous terrain, in the sense that are you imagining the utopia from the point of view of is it a very statist conception of the utopia that you are having here? Or if you are stretching it over a period of time and looking at it civilizationally, then you may think of this utopia as in conflicting terms, that the state is trying to homogenize and have an idea of a utopia in a certain way, which conflicts with the civilizational view of India or South Asia as a country which has invited, people from all across, and the destitutes, and those who have been persecuted. So the pressure is from all sides, and this is what I was trying to emphasize.
Okay, as I said earlier, I mean, I'm looking forward to the discussion, so don't expect to have complete answers, but just in light of, let's say, in a conversation mode, I would say that, see, I mean, my engagement right now is to kind of move away from the forced migration discussion from the global north to that of global south. And even when we talk about global south, we tend to read more on, let's say, the African states. So there seems to be a complete blank, or we draw a blank when we talk about South Asia per se. So the interesting aspect for me is not to make an argument for the sake of argument, but I'll come to the specificity as to what you are determining, what you're asking. The idea, therefore, is to figure out why is it that in the context of South Asia, there is an available literature on theorization of camps as such. All right. And considering that 51, non-51, leaving that aside, the status, project of not signing, leaving that aside, why is it and that, states seem to be, and I don't mean just India, it's all over South Asia. I mean, look at Bangladesh. A small state such as Bangladesh has a huge refugee population. Similarly for Afghanistan, we all know that. This is a very, knowledgeable, group that I'm speaking to, so I don't have to go into that. The idea here is to kind of grapple with the understanding of what is it for the state for, kind of invite refugees in and then segregate. So in one sense, I think there's a continuation. So the post-colonial state, in some sense, I would say, and this is applicable across South Asian states, and India is not an exception to that. That segregation is one of the ways of containing, just that the imperial powers would segregate, the disease from the body, right? So the idea was you need to contain them, you need to control them, right? So camp therefore becomes a site where you can perform protection, meaning, the performativity of protection is also taken care, because it doesn't take much to take care of refugees because their assistance level is so minimalistic, if I can make that argument. So in terms of resources is not the issue. So what is at stake here is large number of refugee groups who decide to stay back. All right. Now I don't want to come back to the case of India, and I'll come to the utopian concept of the construct also. Is why is it that the Tibetan case has a different story, and let's say the Sri Lankan situation is very different at the same time, and at the same time you have a CAA coming in, right? So without going to CAA, what is interesting is what is it is in store for the state to kind of allow refugees to stay. I'm not saying pushing them out. My question is just the other way. So if they are allowing them to stay, then what is interesting is the state has nothing to lose, except here's a contrast, except for the Rohingya situation, which actually does not fit the paradigm, right? And this is actually one of the exceptions which will kind of cost us, at least scholars like all of us who have been really arguing very vociferously that, I mean, I'm not talking about civilizational. I don't like the word civilizational. I rather have common ethnicity or cultural norms that exist across borders. And if you look at it, in the case of India and Pakistan, you will sign around the borders. Similarly, you can say in terms of Bangladesh, as well as you can talk about the Nepalese. So it is just interesting, or is it just something that by chance that these populations share the same culture, same language? So my attempt here is to navigate the terrain which seem to be not so well examined. Very few scholars have discussed this. Now, what I found interesting was Michel Aguirre's work on heterotopia, which talks about the Foucauldian notion of it. Now, the aspect here is when you talk about the utopian state, and this is where I want to bring in the discussion, is the state here, and I don't mean the present regime, I mean state across since 47 onwards, there has been a continuity. Despite whatever we might want to say, there has been a continuity in terms of the policy where refugee containment is in question. So I think, yes, I am kind of favoring, let's put it this way, a status notion. But recently in another talk, I was actually challenged, and it was very interesting to say that even when the Rohingya situation was erupting in Mizoram last year, all right, and in a panel that I was part of, there was one lawyer who was part of the civil society organized body. And here was an interesting story where the Mizoram or the citizen basically they basically came forward and said, no, we are not going to send back, or we're not going to throw them out. It is our cultural understanding that we will allow these, it was about 14, 15, not many. But despite that, government of India had sent a directive that, if you recall that, Mizoram government should not allow any refugees to come in and enter. Despite that, what was interesting is Mizoram government actually went ahead with what they thought was something that they had to do. Of course, it kind of goes against, but it also kind of helps our argument in terms of the concept of belonging, the politics of belonging in that sense.
No, I just a little bit of this thing there that no, I understand my use of the word civilizational is problematic, but I fully understand the use of, say, the word common ethnicity, which problematizes this whole question of who enters, who does not enter. If somebody enters, what should be the treatment? All of the value framework within which the state functions. And I was trying to get into that value framework, which is very problematic.
It is.
And this value framework is stemming from say, I mean, almost 2,500 years. I mean, I would just go back to that. And if the value, and this value framework is also, if we take it as a pluralistic value framework, then it even problematizes it even further. Now, how this whole exercise of trying to homogenize run into difficulties simply because what kind of a value premise is one taking if we are taking this utopian idea forward? That's the problematic that I'm seeing in your, this thing is the conception of the utopia itself. There's no problem with heterotopia here. And what is the terrain, what is the register that can that you are covering in trying to build this whole idea of utopia that Michel Agiers has brought in a very different context?
See, I think somewhere the utopia here is, and if you were to see a continuity of policy, the utopia is that India does not throw out refugees. India has a principle of hospitality. That's what I argue. I don't call it humanitarianism. So on the principle of hospitality, India has always given refuge, right? Not sanctuary, given refuge. If a country has given refuge for a longer period of time, and the issue therefore is the problem did not come to prominence till we had these roadblocks in the case of the Sri Lankan Tamil, which happened in the 90s, and now we are seeing it in the context of Rohingyas, right? So I think theoretically, I'm trying to push the argument here that state may not necessarily think in terms of a larger project, but it is brought to fore, unfortunately, with the present regime, which was completely ambivalent in the case of others. In previous regime, it did not really matter so much, or it wasn't a big question. Because let's not forget the partition refugees, a sizable section of them went back, especially 71, I'm talking about 71, right? So when the new state of Bangladesh came, they did go back, right? So the issue therefore is, what is it there at stake for the nation state of India? So it is in that context, I'm trying to build this argument. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Then there is a question by Sheikh Rafiqullah.
Ma'am, my first question is, could you please elaborate more on the concept of Eurocentric camps and South Asian camps? I mean, what are the differences and similarities between the two camps? And second question is, has there been any studies that has studied the life of the refugees post-camp? I mean, what happens to the life? What kind of life they live once they go out of the camp? And how long do these camps exist, like 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years? And what happens to those camps once the refugees are either accommodated or sent back? Thank you, ma'am.
All right, thank you, Rafiqullah. I mean, see, Eurocentric camps, and I mean, there's ample literature on that, because one has to understand, the whole discussion of 51, emerges on the backdrop of World War, right? So in terms of the formation, camp formation, or the structure of the camp as such, it kind of demarcates a space which is, the image that comes to you is initially would be like, makeshift shelters. But if you have units here in the scene, then it would be more like a concrete houses with rows of houses with proper, well, I won't say proper, but at least basic minimum sanitation and this and that, right? So when I say Eurocentrism, because some of these camp formation really kind of has that Eurocentric bias to it, right? Does that mean that are we talking about something different for Global South? Unfortunately not. So in the Global South, what we have done is we have kind of, we have borrowed the whole thing, the whole concept as well as the practice of it. So hence, I'm kind of emphasizing the Eurocentrism. In terms of your second question of camp life, while you were actually, asking the question, I was fortunate. I mean, I won't say fortunate now, But when my field work for my PhD was on two areas, the Sri Lankan and the Chakma refugees in Tripura. Chakma refugees meaning those who came as a result of the violation in the Chittagong Hill Track in the 80s, not the Kaptai, now not 1968, okay? The creation of the Kaptai Dam. Now, incidentally, about 70,000 of these refugees were successfully repatriated back to Chittagong Hill Track. So this was my PhD. So, which is interesting because when the entire group was successfully, and I mean it within quotes, that's why I'm not saying they were successful or not, that's a different story. So they repatriated, that means they went back to their country of origin, right? After staying for a long period of time, in 98, 97, 98, they were repatriated, okay? So if you were to say that what really happened to the structure, but the structure was demolished, something else came up in its place, especially in Tripura. And I looked into 2-3 districts within Sabroom and others. If you want detail, I can share that later. I mean, in fact, now that my book is out, so you can also see it. I'm not going to publicize it, but it's there. The details are very much available because it's a PhD work. So in terms of lifespan of camps, I must say there is no lifespan, meaning it could go on for eternity, right? So typically when they are entering, it is presumed for a short while. It is presumed that it's going to be in a temporary state. It is presumed that it will be in a transient state only, all right? Unfortunately, what happens is, the time period continues for 10 years, 20 years, as is the case in the case of Sri Lankan Tamil refugees in Tamil Nadu, where there are 112 camps even now as I speak in all the districts of Tamil Nadu. So there are two contrasts then. One is the Sri Lankan Tamil and the Chakmas who actually were returned, and of course their state is in a very, very sorry state, but that's a different thing. In India, the camps were demolished and therefore the structures don't exist even today, right? If you were to go to the same place where I did my fieldwork, you won't find the camps. So I think somewhere camp gives you a sense of, supposed to be a transient stage, and hence that is perhaps the reason the camps are always located far away from the city. You'll never have a camp in the city. However, other than the case that we are now witnessing in let's say, the Syrian case, we might talk about in different parts of Europe, where people are now developing camps for a longer period of time, where camps are now becoming actually an integral part of a city. So where there seems to be a conflation of camp and city. I'm not sure I answered your question, but that's the response I have.
No, ma'am. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Then there are two more questions from Dr. Vishwajit Mohanty. May I ask you, sir, to unmute yourself and ask the questions?
Thank you, Nasreen. It's always a pleasure to hear you always. Just two clarifications. One is that is there a difference between the nature of the post-colonial state and that of state in global north in terms of treating refugees? This is number one. Number two is, as you say, that the camp is an exception and where life meets the juridical state all the time. And do you think that the refugees have no way of getting out and negotiating with the outer world? One case is Bangladesh Rohingya refugees, and in India also. So how do they defy this state of exception and engage with the outer world and the state? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's take the big question first, which is post-colonial. I think absolutely there is a difference in terms of, in a way there is, and there, let's put it this way. The post-colonial state has an underpinning of, there's a decolonization process. Now, often, scholars are now nitpicking on, there is no one form of post-colonial, understanding of state, right? So if we were to say, a South Asian context, if you want to talk about post-colonial state within South Asia, then I would definitely say that in terms of its state formation, it adopted certain kind of trajectory which was kind of similar to other post-colonial states. Now, in the global north, as you would also know, I'm very sure, but just to push the argument is the experience of colonialism actually what makes it very different, right? And since it makes it very different, then what it allows us to do is it allows us to navigate the terrain. So colonialism, with its historical inequality that was imposed on the colonies, and then with the decolonization process leading up to the post-colonial trajectory, is something which is often seen as incomplete, right? If you were to see the trajectory in the African context, one might say that, look, it's still continuing. We haven't reached a full stop at that level. So I would definitely say there is a distinctive difference. And for the post-colonial states, it is a double whammy. Like, it's a double, problem at that level. Not only we inherit the edifice or the structure, we also inherit, the custom, the norms, and everything else. So it makes it hugely problematic to even charter a territory, let alone if they want to do it, that's a different thing, right? Now, a classic case point would be, all of you would say that, CAA became problematic simply because the way and the manner in which it was articulated, the manner in which religion was brought into the scene, where religion is something, has really nothing to do with refugeehood, let alone refugee subjectivity, right? So therefore, I would definitely say that the construction of the post-colonial state is definitely different compared to that of global. But then again, I don't want to homogenize it in terms of it because experiences differ, right? There would be differences in post-colonial, states in Africa, in Latin America, and South Asia, right? However, the liberal principle or principle of liberalism and its other aspect would kind of tie the experiences of the global north somewhat similarly in that level. Okay. Coming to your second question, absolutely. I mean, I think refugees do have agency. And I wasn't trying to sugarcoat when I said exceptionality. I was, on the contrary, I was trying to situate the debate within this, paradox of exceptionality and suggest that, look, when we say exception, we are basically attempting to bypass certain understanding completely. And it's like saying, okay, that's how it's supposed to be. But the issue here is when two factors are very important in navigating this exceptionality. One is prolonged stay by refugees in a host state, all right? And the second is the idea of, having certain kind of common identity markers like language, culture, and an understanding of what it is to belong. These two together, along with a long period of stay, actually helps refugees navigate their refugeehood and also question the subjectivity by asserting their agency. A classic case, I would say again from South Asia region, would be, let's say, three cases I can actually say. The Tibetan case, all right, the Sri Lankan Tamil, and now the Rohingya. Now, if you were to put them one after the other, we'll realize that the Tibetan case is supposedly the most passive, who have always kept a low profile in a different way, and not necessarily, attempted to create any ripple at all. However, if we were to do, I know Sudeep has done extensive work, so he will bear with me. It's very interesting is how they also navigate certain kind of rights. So the passive existence has actually allowed them in certain kind of, navigating certain kind of rights. The Sri Lankan refugee, on the other hand, with a strong ethnic lineage with communities in Tamil Nadu, now the young refugees, especially those who are, third generation Sri Lankan Tamils born in India, want to be citizens of India. How do you then navigate that? The third would be interesting, and that is perhaps a reason that Bangladesh government is pushing them to, this Bhashan Chor and whatnot, because you don't want to make refugees very visible. Even if they speak the same language, practice the same religion. And now I'm bringing in religion, and I am making the provocative statement. Despite this, what we find is in the case of the Rohingyas, that Bangladesh government is attempting to kind of, they did try to repatriate. It didn't work because refugees refused to board the bus. The buses came, UNHCR sent, IOM sent them bus, but they refused to enter the buses and, let alone take them. So what is interesting is there are ample opportunities to assert agency. Yes, absolutely, because that is human nature. And I will never say that there is no space for it. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not, but the process continues.
Can I just come in a little bit here?
Very briefly, Sudipta.
Yeah, very brief. Yeah, this thing. This is just with regard to agency. Very interesting. There was a documentary on the Rohingyas in Bhashan Chor. Some youths, Rohingya youths, just escaped. They left simply because they were fed up with the life in those islands. It was not a life worth living, and the very fact that it's some strange connect with youth elsewhere. The aspirations are still the same, and the very idea of how aspirations can still the same, even though one is leading an abject life, and that's what strikes one very, very much. And I think this has a lot to do with the new kinds of connectivities. So that's just a point.
I mean, Vishwajit, if you recall in our book, we had one author who was talking about the radio, if you remember. Right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, how modern technology is kind of rebuilding community in a very different way. So instead of keeping them calm and close together, of course, these boundaries don't exist. There is a borderless, seamless, camaraderie and solidarity that is being built across, in Southeast Asian states. And yeah, so I again, you're very much aware of that, but that's
right.
Yeah.
Right.
This Shomata's question, I thought I saw somewhere.
Yeah. But before that, there is a related question from Shucharita. Shucharita, will you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Thank you. Thank you, Nasreen, for your really, elaborative talk. So I was actually wondering about belongingness, the notion, because that's something which I am working on, and I'm just reading out to make it brief. So as you said, the sense of belonging to camps, as I look at the situation of Rohingya in Bangladesh, I see it as an emerging home, within quotes for them. And that kind of refutes the notion of exceptionality of refugee camps that you actually highlighted throughout your talk. On the other hand, as you have already pointed out many times, Malki and likewise, they refute this very idea of home and ties of being belonging. How belongingness is tied to a place. So they refute it. So in light of this, how will one read this entire notion of homes, breaking down of homes, rebuilding of culture, assimilation, and also how camps in South Asia, as you correctly said, they are almost semi-settlements. At times they are permanent. Even Palestinian refugee camps, if you look at them, they are settlements now. So and this is of course a kind of home, and in many ways the home that has been left behind remains in imagination, and this will to go back actually is a desire which in my interviews also I feel that, yeah, it's kind of, it's just an imagination. They want to, but they don't visualize it in reality. So that bring us back to the same trope of being, of conceiving belongingness in a new way. So how do we, reading migration in this context, go beyond that, or try to address this issue?
See, I think in my work, in fact, my first work, I would say, I still stand by it, the politics of belonging and the concept of home. See, I think when Malki talks about, what Malki is basically saying, that there is no sedentary bias, So camps, not camps, refugees are often associated with a place. And if place is so integral part of your identity, then the identity becomes crucial to be rooted, right? So you are essentially being rooted through a place, through a territory, through something which is concrete. And hence refugees are uprooted people, and therefore they should not, or they do not have the desire to, belong. And she kind of, critiques that. She's basically suggesting that, look, uprooted exiled population can create a certain kind of rootedness, which I have demonstrated in my work in 2018 book now, especially in my PhD work, on the basis of the two case studies that I had studied. That was the Sri Lankan refugees and that of the Chakma refugees at that point in time. It was way back. So what I had demonstrated was how the refugees, when they stay in camps for a longer period of time, so time is the essence, is very important here. And I don't think there are any refugees who are only staying for 2-3 months or 2-3 years or 4 years, at least in the South Asian context, right? So the longer the duration of stay, and the lesser the probability of them ever wanting to go back, let alone, I don't think they want to go back in the first place. That's one. However, the exception in this case was a Chakma refugee, but that's a different story. So Lisa Malki talks about emplacement and placement, right? So the idea is refugees then attempt to emplace themselves and, trying to reroute it in the camps while attempting to, create a sense of home based on their memories, based on their stories, based on, folk, whatever custom that they have. So they are practicing the same in the camps. Of course, she did it in the context of an African context, but if you were to see that, it is very much applicable in the context of let's say, the Sri Lankan refugees. Because the Sri Lankan refugee, they are, kind of seamlessly, they have, kind of entered in a very different, of course, special camps were there, with Rajiv Gandhi's assassination, another story happened. So, of course, they went through that period also. But today, as I speak in 2021, there are about more than 1 lakh and, of population who are still there when there is no war again in Sri Lanka, right? And I'm not talking about older generation. I'm talking about younger generation. I'm talking about third generation refugees, okay? And these are refugees that I kind of, when I went back to the field in 2013, 14 again, and 15, I went back to the field again just to reconnect with them. And I was fortunate to actually find the lady that I had interviewed way back in 2005-06. Imagine that lady actually, she must be giving interviews to n number of researchers, right? But for her, the story is still the same. And her only story is, this is my home. And it is at that point in time that I had actually examined the issue of construction of home among refugees, especially those who want to stay and those who want to leave. All right. So I think Lisa Malki's work is very significant. And if you want to look at it in the context of, let's say, emplacement and placement, that makes it very interesting, because the issue of belonging, that's when I actually brought about this argument of politics of belonging, especially through my work. So I think that is a very important intervention, because how do we tie the South Asian cases together? A similar argument, something that I have not looked at for my work, but I have sporadically, the Tibetan case also, you can say. They're all interspersed all over India. And actually, they're not only in Delhi. They're in Orissa, they're in Karnataka, they're in Tamil Nadu. And it's very interesting how the communities stay together. I mean to say, in terms of the family, right? And they're just not one generation, they're 3 generations, 4 generations of them, right? And of course, in terms of the strategic importance is different. They are now refugees, others aren't. They have cards, these people don't have, or similarly, whatever that might be. So I think somewhere, if you are looking at the concept of home, and if you're trying to do that in the Rohingya case, please do that, because I think somewhere what we are lacking is we don't necessarily examine the theoretical, perspective, or we don't do that. We just give the empirical reality. Don't do that. I would say try to have a concrete theoretical framework, because that will allow you to have a conversation not only in South Asia, but those in Africa also. So I think I will strongly encourage you to, if that's what you're looking at, I'm very happy for you. Okay. Roger, there was another question.
Yeah, that's from Sriporna Banerjee. It's related to this question also. Yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. It was a wonderful presentation. I also had this thought, which was already, I think, raised that currently regarding the Rohingya issue, like the Rohingyas are put in the island of Bhashanchar, which is currently popularly being referred to as a floating detention center. So like it was just told by somebody that there have been news that many Rohingyas have been fleeing from there due to the degraded state of living and security concerns. So, ma'am, I was thinking that can these be a part of, the neglect of the civic conditions and the responsibility of the government providing asylum to them?
You mean Indian government?
No, the Bangladesh government.
Okay. Look, I think, unfortunately, there are two aspects to refugee protection also. There's a donor fatigue and there's a host fatigue also. So donor fatigue in this case would be, let's say, as soon as the Rohingya situation actually, emerged, if you recall, all of a sudden there were a lot of international, aid agencies were really, making a beeline, and they're still there. But the issue is everybody is, looking through the lens of durable solution, which is really problematic. There is no durable solution to refugees. If you are a UNHCR expert, then yes, you will look for a durable solution. But if we are as a researcher, we know for a fact that for refugees, the durable solution or any solution, resolution can come as long as they are willing to go back and they're able to lead a dignified life also. So I think what is happening, unfortunately, is Bangladesh government is now experiencing that fatigue a bit, and perhaps they are now attempting to, where repatriation is not happening in Myanmar completely. So the idea is to relocate them while the resources are available. Like, this is something, there's a lot of international aid that is coming in, right? So unfortunately, the location where supposedly, they're supposed to be housed is so problematic, and it's in a lowland area that it will get flooded. Everybody knows that. Yet at the same time, refugees are being encouraged, okay, to go back, or encouraged to basically, go to Bhashanchar. I don't think any refugee would like to go to a place where they will not have their livelihood, they will not have any kind of dignity. I mean, it's just like any other person. They're just human beings, right? So I think there's a lot of pressure on the government of Bangladesh to find a solution, but the solution is unfortunately eluding them. Because I don't think the Rohingyas will willfully go to Bhashanchar, all of them. It will take a lot of time.
Then there is a question from Dr. Kasturi Datto.
So Dr. Chowdhury, I think, thank you so much for the talk. Now, I am still reading and I'm still getting exposed to the literature, but this question comes from whatever I've heard today, primarily, and a little bit I read the foundational literature which was shared. I was basically interested if you could, throw a little light on how, when we study the camp and the community staying in the camp, what kind of inherent inequalities, hierarchies which develop within the camp, like as an outsider, if I see the camp, I might consider it to be, in a way, culturally homogeneous, socially homogeneous. But then, are there any literature which perhaps would help in understanding better, to understand, how fragmented that they can really get when they stay together over time, and how their priorities shape and reshape their, sense of belongingness together when they have been united in a common past, in a common crisis situation of war, etc.
I didn't understand your definition of belonging, because that's not how I have defined it. Belongingness is not necessarily just staying together or having a commonness. So that's something probably you might have to kind of, additionally look at. But I understood your question. I think, see, it's like this. I would say, as somebody who has worked for a long time on forced migration, I would say, if you were to, in a room, if you were to have 10 people in a 10 by 10 room, if you were to keep 15% together, what do you think would happen?
Well, there would be lots of divergences and convergences, negotiations, chaos. Absolutely.
Let's be very blunt. There'll be chaos.
Yeah.
There won't be divergence. There won't be convergence. There'll be utter chaos, right? Because the space is such that is something that we take for granted. So when we are in our own house, residence, we know this is our room and this is our house and this is where I go back to. Of course, the same analogy does not apply where refugee camps are concerned, because they don't have a house, they don't have a space, they don't have go back to. That's where they are put, right? So I think somewhere the sacrosanct of a space and the idea that it's being shared, there is the liminal existence in some sense, you can say the liminality. Along with that, bring in economics, political economy, like, resource question, assistant question. Obviously, to manage that chaos, what you have is a camp leader. So camp leader's job is to basically figure out that there is no chaos, there is discipline, there's no infighting. But does that mean it does not happen? Of course not. There's a lot of domestic violence happening. In fact, one of my field visits, I walked into one of them while it was kind of happening with the officials that I had gone to. Do you think I was able to do anything? No, we cannot. Just like laws exist at every domain. So I think somewhere, I'm not trivializing, but I'm just trying to make you kind of, get that sense that as a researcher, if you were to go to a Jhuggi Jhopri also, right, you will see that the space is such an issue, right? And you will see that along with that, there's issue of livelihood, right? So what really becomes problematic is that becomes their home for a long time. And they have no control over what is going to happen to their lives because they have moved involuntarily. So in other words, for reason beyond their control, they had to just flee. And when that happens, you obviously have a different sense of, the precarity of it is very different. The existence is so problematic. Now, since you brought in belonging, the belonging concept I brought in differently because the whole idea is what makes, let's say, communities then feel, or why do they stay on? They stay on because they don't have a choice. That's one. The other could be that over a period of time, they build ties. Because camps in South Asia has not had this kind of severe restriction, meaning they have specific time to exit and entry, right? So in other words, they get the opportunity to mingle with the population. But then they, like in the case of Sri Lankan case, I would say, there's been intermarriages also. And the government of government of Tamil Nadu has done nothing. They have not, in fact, intervened. Now, what is interesting here, and this is where I'm going to just leave it, is the gender question. Let's say a Sri Lankan boy marries a Indian Tamil, so that lady comes back, enters the camp. You see, that becomes the marital home, right? Now, if the other way it happens, then there's an opportunity to do the reverse. So a lot of food for thought.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, ma'am, there is one last question left in the chat box from Shamotadi, Dr. Shamota Vishwas. Then there is another question from Dr. Moushumi Dattapat. So please, Shamotadi, will you?
I have a very brief question, Nasreen. That is, you have been talking about how the camps that we have today are a legacy of the of colonialism. So I just wanted to know a bit more about this.
Well, in terms of, let's say, the partition, right? Some of these in the context of, let's say, 47 and 71, right? Some of these camps that were constructed moved on to become colonies, right? So those who stayed back actually structurally, in terms of how do you then, make it into a transit camp to a residential area. So I think in terms of its colonial legacy, one would say that in the South Asian context, but then I will go beyond that a bit, but during the colonial time also, when during the colonial time, when labor was, used to move around, like, migrants would, were moved from point A to point B to construct railways, construct, a whole lot of other stuff, in fact, just menial labor also, right? So most of them, when they were moving, they were seen as pariah, outsider, right? And since they were outsider, their location, in fact, I mean, I had a section of it, in my paper also, which I did not kind of, the historical context of camp also. I thought I had 45 minutes, so I didn't want to spend too much time in that, where the idea was those who came as migrant labor, right? They did not necessarily, get a secluded area or space where they could live. Most of them were kept together. The flock needed to be kept together, right? And since they were kept together, they were also associated as, as house, welfare camps in that sense. So what it allowed them to do is allowed them to segregate and contain. So this principle or policy of segregation and containment is something that the post-colonial state has actually done very, very effectively. And if we were to move beyond, let's say, the 47 and 71 and talk about other camps, right? What we see is, with the exception of here, again, it's the exception of the Tibetan camp, what we see is almost, all camps have a similar trajectory.
Dr. Pathak, if you are here, you can ask your question.
It was a very interesting presentation, and moreover, I just wanted to, it is not a question basically, it is an observation. Don't you feel, ma'am, that since the days of the partition, the post-colonial state always had the intention not only of segregation and containment, but to keep the refugees at places which were not very habitable sites, whether you talk of Dandokaranya and Morijhapi, or even in Assam. I had opportunity while working on my PhD to look at the camps in Assam. So the camp which still is existing, and then which had been transformed from the camps, they had been moved over to colonies. But even the colonies are in areas which did not have proper water supply, proper electrification. So don't you think that it is not only with the Rohingyas, but since partition, this was the attitude of the post-colonial state? So that is only an observation which I wanted to make. What do you think about it, ma'am?
Thank you so much. I completely agree. There is no disagreement on that, because I think most host states, I think all host states, I would say, have this policy of, kind of leaving them in a terrain where it's difficult to navigate. So the first thing is not to provide them regular water, right? Because with water, habitation begins, right? So we find that, it's the more difficult it is, you will be fetching water from whatever place that is close by. So I don't think there is any, you're absolutely correct in your observation that that has been the position. But, somewhere what we are witnessing, I mean, of course, in post-colonial era, we might say that, but what about other cases that is emerging, right? What about, let's say, different, if you were to go outside South Asia, let's say the Syrian refugees, okay? Now, in let's say the European, other parts of Europe, or let's say the Calais, where the famous camp is. Now, what is interesting is here, the camp formation kind of goes in a different direction, because now the issue is, it's a reality that each state has to contend with. Not so long ago, one of the Scandinavian countries had actually said that in order to enter that particular country, refugees were asked to give up their precious belonging. I think Denmark did it, or some other country, if I'm not mistaken, but basically said that you have to kind of give your precious, belonging in order to enter a particular country. So in other words, refugees were basically given a choice that whatever cash, jewelry or whatever you might have in your possession, you need to cash in order to get into a particular locality. So in other words, there are different politics of sanctuary also. So if you were to move it from camp, refuge to sanctuary, then we find a different definition evolving. But I completely agree with you. I just wanted to give you another picture also.
Seems there is no more questions left. So thank you, ma'am, for your excellent lecture, and thank you for the participants who have actively participated in this discussion. We hope we will get more participations, more discussions in our future classes. Hope we will meet you again on tomorrow's class with Professor Aisha Challer on 6:30 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, CRG. And of course, Shamota, who pretty much directed me that this is it. And it's very hard not to follow Shamota. And then you have Sucharita kind of being the gentle nudger, that, I'm going to help you. And then you have Rajat calling up saying, no, it's okay. We can, you can enter 15 minutes early. So it's a lovely, it was very seamless. And thank you so much. I hope I was able to do justice to what you guys had in mind. But I really enjoyed the session, and thank you so much for your questions. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.